Hey everybody, my name is Rick, and if this is your first time here, thank you for watching. This is actually the first woodworking project that I've shared on my channel, and for all my subscribers who have been here for a long time, thank you guys also for watching along. You guys know I like to share my passions with you, and woodworking is a huge part of my life, you know, along with the cars and cycling and all that stuff. So I thought that I would show you one of the builds that I'm kind of in the middle of right now. I'm not going to go into huge detail and show you every single part of this build, but I wanted to give you a general idea of how I make my epoxy tables and show you kind of a little bit of the process. I'm actually ready today to do the pour. So what I'm making right now is basically a table that is going to be a sofa table, and we already have the legs for it, and actually a table that kind of came prefab that we bought a couple years ago. And I have these really beautiful slabs that I got from a good friend of mine, Dan, from work. And so I wanted to use one of them for something for the house. So I'm gonna build this table and replace that tabletop over there and see how it comes out. So basically I wanted to show you how I got the slabs and then the steps getting to where I'm ready to actually put them into the mold. And then I'll show you the pour, and then subsequently I'm gonna give you some tips as things that I've learned over the last probably year and a half or so that I've been doing this. I'm certainly not the end-all be-all of epoxy tables. There are some incredible woodworkers on YouTube that you can find, and just a few of the ones that I really like are Black Forest Wood Company. They're out of Canada. There's Blacktail, who is, Cam is unbelievable, makes just incredible stuff. And John Malecki, who's kind of just a crazy fun guy who does a lot of neat stuff on his website as well. So those guys are really incredible, and I've learned a lot of stuff from them. So hopefully you can pick up at least a couple tips from me if this is brand new to you. And if you have any questions, or if you see something and you've been doing this a long time and you see me doing something goofy, or that you think you can help me change the way I do things, I'm certainly more than welcome for constructive criticism. So I bought these slabs from, like I said, my buddy Dan. I think I mentioned it in the shop tour video a while back. They're pretty flat for the most part. Still have bark on them, which I remove. But basically have not been really sanded. They're still pretty rough. If you have a slab and you know what size table you're gonna do, you get a general idea of what you're gonna make. It starts in this form, and what I generally like to do is I will run it through my my drum sander, which is this guy right here. I don't have a planer that's wide enough. My planer is only 13 inches, which is this guy right here. So what I'll do is I'll run them through the drum sander a bunch of times, and I'll get them to where they're not, you know, perfectly sanded, but they're pretty flat. And from here, the next step, what I do is determine where I want to cut the slab down the middle. So if you look at this one, basically the way that this works is this was the board, and it's together like that. You split it down the middle, and then you take the live edge and you build what's going to be your river, right? And that can be determined by many things. How wide you want your river, how big the table is, and you can actually use different sides. It just depends on what you like. It's all your preference. From here, the next step is once you determine, you know, how wide you want it and how long, etc. And I always leave it a little bit wider, probably an inch or so, and a little bit longer than I need, because you're always going to have to do a bunch of sanding, and you're always going to have to do some trimming once you get your table out of the mold after you do your epoxy pour. So the next thing after you split it down the middle, you get your two pieces, is then you're going to get yourself a straight edge on each side, and you're going to straighten up the outside edges as well. So again, these are rough cut, but this is flat now, and I have a nice 90-degree edge here, and I'm, you know, basically all around. And then from there, I come over and I build a mold. Generally, I'll use melamine. It's not crazy expensive, and I can usually get a few tables out of at least part of the mold. So a lot of people will just use melamine and they'll use mold release. I actually like to use tape Here's some of the older tape I've used. This is basically like packing tape. It works really well. And then also, you know, you build your sides. I generally will screw them into each other, and it's also screwed into this bottom board. And the absolute key to your mold and to building an epoxy river table is you do not want this to leak in any way, shape, or form. Epoxy is like water when you pour it in here to start with, and it'll find absolutely any crack it can, and it will leak if you do not take pains to ensure that it does not. So after you build the mold, you can see I've got silicone in here. Every little spot that it could leak. I even do the bottom as well. I'll put silicone. So, and you want to give it at least, I mean, around here it dries honestly in about an hour, but I always give it at least half a day. Generally overnight is better if you can get that, let that silicone really dry. So my biggest tip I can give you if you're new to building epoxy tables, take the time, build a very good mold, and make sure it's not going to leak. After you build your mold, you're going to put your pieces inside here. And I also, at this point, what I'll do is I will put this, I have a special table that I actually do all my pouring on, which I'm not going to put it on now, but I will put boards underneath to lift the table up whatever I'm on so that I can actually use blocks and clamp these pieces down. I clamp it in the corners and also in the middle, because the epoxy will get under here and it'll float. And you may think that you have it to where it's not going to, but I strongly recommend that you clamp these down with boards. Let's say you're using a piece like this, obviously it would be a little bit bigger, but put the tape on here as well, because if you stick this on here and clamp it down and you get epoxy on top of your table, it is going to be a big pain in the butt to separate your little block here from the epoxy on the table. So always tape these as well. Another tip there, and always clamp down. From here, basically, you're ready to pour your resin. And there are resin or epoxy calculators online that you can use. I suggest that you do. And you basically take measurements across, you average those out, you figure out what your depth is here, and it'll give you a very good estimate of about how much epoxy you need. And I'll go ahead and do that here, and I'll give you an idea of how much epoxy I need here. And then once we're done, I'll tell you how much I used and see how close the calculator was. All right, so we're dealing with 59.5 inches long. And what we need to figure out is our average width of our river. And you can see here that I've put numbers and I basically measured the width. So we got an average. I did 15 measurements. And the more measurements you do, obviously the more accurate it's going to be. And we came out with an average width of 3.28. And essentially what you do is you add all these numbers together, which is 49.25. You divide by the number of measurements that you took. And that's our average width. And then you go over to the epoxy calculator and you insert those numbers. 59.5 long, 3.28 inches wide, curing thickness of 1.25, and that's basically, that's just the, you know, the thickness of the wood, obviously. And so it's saying we're going to need about 1 gallon of epoxy. So what I'm probably going to do, and I think a gallon is what, 128 ounces. So I'll probably do like 138 to 140 ounces just to be sure, because like I said, it's going to shrink, it's going to move around, it's going to sneak in these little voids here. There's just really nothing you can do about it. You can try to put, like I said, the silicone underneath, but I haven't had much luck, so I don't really fight it anymore. I just make sure that I clamp it down and pour it and just use a little extra. Yeah, these are pretty heavy. So another important step, and something else I wanted to mention as a really big tip, is you want to make sure your table that you're pouring on and that your slabs and everything are level. But I'm first going to clamp this down, and then we're going to keep checking level just to make sure. And if you don't do that, basically, like I said, again, the epoxy is going to go to the area of least resistance. So if it's lower on this end of the table, it's going to flow over here, and you're going to be a little heavy on this side, and you're going to be a little low on this side, and it just makes the sanding, I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it just makes the sanding more of a pain, trying to get everything flat and straight and all that good stuff. So double check, triple check that you're not going to leak. Double check, triple check that you're nice and level before you do your pour. So there it is, all set up, and now I'm going to check level and see how we're doing with that. All right, so that's pretty darn close. I'm happy with that. So we're going to go ahead and mix up some epoxy and pour it on in. So I'm going to vacuum, blow this out, and then we'll start mixing epoxy. This is my setup that I'm going to use today to pour. I'm going to do about 135 ounces or so, give or take. And I don't have any bigger containers than this right now, so I'm going to do it in 2 mixtures of about 66 ounces total. This is a 2-to-1 epoxy. I always suggest putting something down on whatever you're mixing on, unless you absolutely don't care about it, because you're going to make a little bit of a mess. So this is black, and I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like charcoal. It has a pearl in it, which is real cool. But I want this one to be pretty black and not have a ton of color in it because of the, well, I'll show you in a video, but because of the yellow in the wood, the soft wood, it's going to look real pretty with the black. So you're going to see me use this and this. Normally I would just use the pearl black, but we're going to go ahead and use the dark black as well. Now, take your A when you're done with it, put it far away. Ask me how I know. And then we're going to use a pretty good amount of this pearl in here because it's going to be a lot. So we're going to try to match this up between each bucket because we're going to do 2 of these. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect because they'll all mix in together at the end, but we're going to start with that. And I'm going to start with 5 drops of this and see how it goes. So once you start getting this mixed up and you're pretty happy with your color, then you're going to want to mix in part B. And it doesn't have to be thoroughly mixed. I just like to get an idea of what I'm working with here before I mix in and start the clock on the hardener. So that's a real pretty black there. You can see the little bit of the pearl in it, hopefully, from the camera. But it's kind of, if you just do the pearl on its own, it's real, got a lot of pearl to it. So I like this. This kind of tones it down some. You'll see when we mix in the B here that it's going to obviously get a little bit, it's not going to be quite as dark, so we might have to add a little bit more. But we're going to start here. We did 44 ounces. So half of 44 is 22. Hopefully my math skills are not failing me. So we're going to go up to 66. And I'm not going to show you this whole stirring process, but throughout this process you want to rub the sides, you want to rub the bottom, and try to get this stuff mixed up as good as you can. Some people will use one of those little paint things on a drill. It's a little more of a pain, but I actually like doing this. You want to scrape the sides, scrape the bottom. Every now and then do this when you're stirring this stuff up. And just keep going. So we hit about 10 minutes here. I always like to go a little bit longer just because I'm paranoid. But again, scraping the sides, doing these numbers, you know, and I'll just keep mixing it up. 10 minutes is a long time to have to stir. So you play little games here. So at this point, what I like to do, and this is just tips I've learned from the other folks I mentioned earlier, is I'm going to let it sit for about 5 minutes or so, and then I'm going to pop the bubbles that are in there. And then really with this, you don't really get a bunch of bubbles that form on its own. I mean, you do get some, but only when after you pour it and you mix it inside to kind of swirl it around, do you have to really worry about bubbles. So we're going to let this sit a little bit. So with the second pour is finished, as you can see, there's just a few little bubbles that will kind of pop on their own. And it's pretty level at this point. I'm gonna give it some time. It'll settle. As I mentioned, it'll seep into different spots underneath on the sides. And as you can see here, I made about 35 ounces of extra epoxy. And the reason for that was, I discovered earlier, is I measured initially and thought it was 1 1/4 inch, the slab, and really it was an inch. And so I should have only made about a gallon of epoxy instead of, or 100 ounces of epoxy versus 130, whatever I made, 2 or 4. So I'm gonna use that extra epoxy for just a little side project, which you'll see a little bit later. And here on the end, you can kind of see that it's a little bit lower than the other side. And even though I tried as best as I could to get it level, it doesn't always work out to where it flows completely perfectly. And it's not a big deal. It'll be taken care of with sanding at the end. You just don't want it to be a huge difference. It is about 3 hours later, and as you can see here, probably on the camera, it's a little bit thick on the end here, but sometimes what happens is the ends or certain parts of the pour will harden up before others. And right here you can see it's definitely thickened up, and then strangely the middle was actually very far along compared to actually both ends. So it gets to a point where you don't want to mess with it anymore. Like, you can still stir the ends on this one, but right beyond about that point right there, you don't want to mess with it. It can kind of cause a little bit of a weird crust and just make sanding a little bit more difficult. At this point, it's going to harden up pretty quickly, and there's really not a whole lot else to do with it. If I was really trying to get a very uniform pattern and get the swirls all the same, this would stress me out really bad. But since I'm not, I want the swirls to be pretty subtle. Not a big deal. This is another 20 or 30 minutes later, and the ends are now starting to thicken up more than they were. And it's just getting further along, and then finally it does harden up all the way across and works out really well. So I just got back from Sedona. I left on Thursday. Today's Sunday afternoon. But I'm going to go ahead and unmold this. You can see it's nice and firm. And I think I showed this to you already, but we only had just a tiny bit of shrinkage, which the less shrinkage, the better. Am I right? As I talked about before, if you don't put tape on these things will basically bond to the wood, and that's a real big pain. So you always want to tape up or mold release. So here you can see how we have leakage around the sides, all on the back here, and there's a little bit of a ridge also on the side here. So this is the bottom of the table, and we'll flip this over and give you a better idea of that ridge. And this will be the top. At this point, what I'll do is I will run this through the drum sander a number of times to kind of clean up either the top or the bottom. Just depends on which side seems to be the flattest, which I'm thinking the bottom looks like it's pretty smooth right now, so that should probably work. Once I get it to where it's pretty flat on the top, I'm going to spin it over and start taking that extra epoxy off the bottom. I'll put it through the machine probably 15 or 20 times, just taking off a barely little bit each time. And I'll put it through, rotate it, put it through, adjust it. Put it through, rotate it, adjust it. All right, so this is the bottom of the table now with all that excess epoxy taken off. So now I'm going to work on cleaning up one edge. So now that I've got it squared off on all sides, I'm going to continue to run the top side through the sander until we get it level all the way across. It's still about a 1/16, and get this all sanded down, and you'll see this will be turn white here once I get it all level. So I got to run it through the sander probably at least 10 more times. Once I get it all sanded and flat, generally what I'll do now is I'll put a 1/4 inch round over on the top surface, and I'll do a bevel on the bottom. Basically that's what you see me doing here with the router. Depending on the table or what I'm doing, sometimes I'll do the 60 grit and the 80 grit first, and then I'll do this. It just depends on my mood, really. So now that we have flat, we have edges, I've got the round over on the top and then the bevel on the bottom. Now what we're going to do is go through the grits. I usually start with the back. So 60, 80, 120, 180, 240, 320. That's generally what I use. This is that little project piece I did with the extra epoxy, and I poured these little guys in there that I had, and I'm really not liking it all that much. I didn't realize they had holes in them, and then you can see that I've run these just through the drum sander, and it takes the color off. So we're going to ignore that side, and I'm gonna sand this side right now. So here it is with the lines from the drum sander taken out. That's just the pattern from there. That's with 60 done, and I want to show you kind of the difference. I think you'll be able to see it. You see all the little lines here from the 80 grit on the drum sander, and then you get over here, you can see it's starting to smooth out. And this is from using the orbital and spending some time here at 60 grit. So we are at 120 now. This is kind of a sneak peek of what it'll eventually look like with this finish on it. I've been moistening this up between each grit, which normally I don't do, but I thought I would try it, just see if it gives me any smoother results. Normally I just do it on the last grit. Just kind of raise the fibers if you're not familiar, and then you finish off with the final sand. But not sure if you can see with the light, but you can kind of see the pattern starting to come out, and it's real subtle like I liked, so which I was shooting for, and it actually looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. The table on the bottom I sanded to 240, and on the top I did 320, and I'm getting ready to finish the table completely as far as putting the Rubio monocoat on it. This is the first time I'm using this product. If you've not heard of it, it's just basically a hard wax, and I saw this on a couple of different channels, so I thought I would try it. I've been using Osmo before that. You don't need very much at all. In fact, I think I put 3 teaspoons of the main part of it in, and just 1 of the accelerator. And the accelerator basically just allows you to have full cure in about 7 days versus, I think it's a couple weeks or something. So anyway, here is the bottom right now. As you can see, it's really rich. Makes it look so much more rich and darkens it up and really pops that yellow sapwood, which is real pretty. So this is the bottom, and as soon as this gets a little bit dry, you're supposed to wipe it down again, just get the excess off. And then I'm going to flip it over and do the top, and most likely I will have to touch up the bottom again in a couple of days. But one of the things I've learned from these guys doing these tables, it's not a good idea to finish one side and leave the other side unfinished for too long, because it can cause it to cup. So like I said, I will flip it over once this, maybe in about 15 minutes, and then I will finish the top, give the top a couple full days to dry. You can touch this after about 24 hours, and then I'll flip it back over and then touch up whatever I have to touch up here. Even if I have to sand it, I'll do that, and then put another very small bit of coat on here. It's a couple days after I put that coat on the top of the table, and as I mentioned, I flipped it over, resanded the bottom, put in the inserts for the legs, and then put one final coat on, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So I now have the table inside the house. Chloe's checking it out. And this is what it looks like in the space that we're using it. And the original table matched these chairs here, so those are not a perfect match of the wood color, but they'll be fine for now. I don't know that I'll do anything for the benches, but we'll wait and see. But overall, I'm very happy with how the table came out. It's a very subtle pearl in the black, and I really like that Rubio monocoat. It worked out real easy to put on and pretty easy to deal with in general. And it also smells really good when you're putting it on, so that's a nice bonus. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and a like. And if you'd like to see more woodworking videos now and then on the channel, I'm not going to do woodworking all the time, but if it's something you'd like to see more of, please let me know. I really enjoy doing it, and I do it all the time, so I appreciate it. Thanks guys, we'll see you next time.